Okay, guys, welcome back to our Cooper Book Club, Reading Between the Wines. We are now on chapter 13. We're going to go into schedules of reinforcement. And now we have the beautiful PDF version of the book. So we'll be able to follow along that way. Thanks to Miss Tanea. All right, so Chapter 13 goes into talking about concepts and principles. B5, define and provide examples of schedules of reinforcement. And then it's going to go into applications. G, behavior change procedures. G1, use positive and negative reinforcement procedures to strengthen a behavior. So remember, both positive and negative reinforcement are going to strengthen the behavior. Use reinforcement procedures to weaken behavior. So if we want to decrease a behavior, then we're going to use DRAs, FCTs, DROs, DRLs, or NCRs. And then G22, use procedures to promote maintenance. Okay, this is so cool. Like, I don't even have to look down anymore. Okay, so what is a schedule of reinforcement? It's a rule that describes a contingency of reinforcement, the environmental arrangement that determine conditions by which behavior will produce reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement and extinction provide the boundaries for all other schedules of reinforcement. A schedule of continuous reinforcement, a CRF, provides reinforcement for each occurrence of the behavior. So schedules of reinforcement are really, really important so that everybody on your team, so you're the BCBA, you're the one that's going to determine the reinforcement schedule for your client. And we just want to make sure that everybody on the team is reinforcing them at the same frequency or requiring the same amount of work. Because if one person is running an FR1 and giving reinforcement after every one correct response, and then we have another person running a VR5, and then you start to see an increase in behavior over here with the VR5 person. And what's happening is the client is going into what we call ratio strain. So making sure that everybody's on the same page as far as reinforcement schedules and when to deliver that reinforcement. And then it talks about continuous reinforcement combined with extinction. So that's where you're going to start talking about differential reinforcement, because those are the ones that talk about we're going to put this behavior on extinction, but we're going to provide them with an alternative or an incompatible. So you always want to make sure that you are giving them that replacement behavior. And then knowing the difference between continuous and discontinuous. So that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter. Okay. And then I just click on it. Okay, cool. Intermittent reinforcement. So between continuous reinforcement and extinction, many intermittent schedules of reinforcement are possible in which some, but not all, occurrences of the behavior are reinforced. Only selected occurrences of behavior produce reinforcement with an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. CRF is used to strengthen behavior primarily during the initial stages of learning and with new behaviors. So continuous reinforcement, that's the one that's going to be for those little babies or your new learners or a new skill. I'm going to be providing them reinforcement for every opportunity so that I could strengthen that behavior immediately and for every single one. Sorry. And then intermittent is where we're going to start varying it up. So we're going to start fading our reinforcement out, and we're no longer going to provide them reinforcement for every time he says, or every time teacher says clap hands, I reinforce him every single time. So he's already learned that skill, so that's no longer necessary. So that's when you start to move on to intermittent reinforcement. Maintenance of behavior. Maintenance of behavior refers to the lasting change of behavior, regardless of the type of behavior change technique employed or the degree of success during treatment. Applied behavior analysts must be concerned with sustaining gains after terminating a treatment program. So I always explain to everybody how anytime you're teaching a skill, there's different phases of learning, right? So you have your first phase, which is going to be your baseline or your probing. So we just want to check in, see if they have the skill, yes or no. And then you have your intervention phase where we're going to start teaching it. And once they've got it, then you go into your maintenance, or is it generalization then maintenance? Right? Generalization, then maintenance. Maintenance is the final one, right? Eventually you want them to be able to maintain that skill across, or even after treatment has ended. So that will be like your final lasting change of your behavior, and it's going to determine the success of your treatment. And then in this example, does somebody want to read the Zofia example now that we can all share this the book? Okay, I'll go. Okay, so for example, Zofia, that's a funny name with a Z, like instead of Sophia, Zofia. Zofia is in the 7th grade and taking French, her first foreign language class. After a few weeks, the teacher informs Zofia's parents that she is failing the course. The teacher believes that Zofia's problems in French have resulted from lack of daily language practice and study. The parents and teacher decide that Zofia will record a tally on a chart kept on the family bulletin board each evening that she studies French for 30 minutes. Zofia's parents praise her practice and study accomplishments and offer encouragement. During a follow-up meeting 3 weeks later, the parents and teacher decide that Zofia has done so well that the telling procedure has stopped. Unfortunately, a few days later, Zofia is once again falling behind in French. So do you guys think that that program was successful or that that skill has been maintained?
No, that's not been maintained.
No. So we should have probably continued the tally program and continued to allow her to gain access to that reinforcement.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. However, gains were not maintained after removing the tally procedure. The parents and the teacher did not establish intermittent reinforcement. So they just went straight from being continuous to just cutting off reinforcement completely. So continuous reinforcement was used correctly to develop daily study behavior. However, after the study behavior was established, the tally procedure was removed. They should have continued to praise her and encourage daily practice after gradually offering fewer encouragements. So it's just talking about how important it is to go from that continuous to intermittent. The parents could have praised Sophia's accomplishment after every second day of daily practice, then after every fourth, then once per week, and so on. With the intermittent praise, Sophia might have continued daily practice after removing the tally procedure. Does anybody know why intermittent reinforcement is so much more powerful, I guess?
I always think of it as like going to the casino and the people who do like the slot machine, because you never know when you're going to get it. So every single time it's like, this might be the time.
Exactly. That's exactly it. It becomes more valuable because they don't know when it's coming. but they know that it's going to happen eventually. So I have contacted reinforcement in the slot machine before. So one time I put a quarter in and I got $1 million. So now that's become so motivating to me. So I'm just going to keep on going. Even if it never happens again, I'm still going to continue to engage in that behavior because it did happen one time. So that's why they say that intermittent reinforcement is one of the hardest to reverse. So I always like to think about those toxic boyfriend situations, right? So once I started studying ABA and studying behavior, then I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Why my toxic ex, so okay, let's say toxic ex-boyfriend, he would cheat on me. And then I would break up with him, and then he would come to my mom's house and fill my car with roses and do all these grand gestures, like and so I would contact that reinforcement again. And he's like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'll change. And you're like, oh, that was so sweet of you. I can't believe you went out of your way and bought me a new purse and filled my car with roses. That's so sweet. So then you forgive him, right? And then he's nice to you for a while, and then boom, it happens again. And then so they basically put you on a varied schedule of reinforcement, on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. I do get access to that reinforcing behavior, which is the romantic wow moments. But I also get access to those punishing moments. So that's like an example of intermittent reinforcement. And that's why girls or people continue to go back to those toxic relationships, because they put them on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement where they're sometimes getting access to that $1 million prize every once in a while. So that's how I've always thought about intermittent reinforcement. And you'll see on mocks that it might ask something like, which is the hardest schedule of reinforcement to reverse, or something like that. And it's always going to be the VR. Anybody else have any examples of intermittent reinforcement, or somebody put you on a intermittent schedule?
I don't necessarily have an example, but like I also think of it as some people unintentionally use the intermittent punishment, like unintentionally, and I think that has kind of the same effects of not working as well. So I guess the opposite effect, but I was just going to say, like, I don't think they touch on it, but I definitely feel like intermittent punishment happens unintentionally a lot.
Yeah. I was reading this, or I was watching this like video or TikTok or one of those reels where it was talking about how when you're in those like toxic relationships, those like abusive ones, where that that interaction with them releases some type of like cortisone, or I don't know, something in your brain. So then your brain kind of, you like those moments or something. I don't know, but it's like a psychology thing, has nothing to do with us. But I thought that was pretty interesting too. It's kind of like that, where it's like you just keep on going back for more. I don't know. I'm just always so amazed by human behavior. Now that I'm working with adults, and we've been working on like social cues with one of my older kids, I was thinking like, okay, well, how did I learn social cues? And it's all based off of like observing people, right? And just things that you've observed. Like I didn't study ABA when I was younger or when I was a teenager learning to interact with boys or whatever. I just watched other people or saw my friends or, you know, and so I just was getting ideas. I'm like, well, maybe we can go sit at Starbucks and just people watch, you know, and be like, hey, how do you think those people are feeling? Or look, they look like they're on a date. Does she look happy? Does she look like she's enjoying that conversation? I don't know where I was going with that, but
No, I get it. I do it all the time with my husband, or my husband and I would just be nosy and be like, I think those two are fighting. This happened before this.
yeah, or like they're on a first date. Look at them, they're all stiff.
Like one time went out to our local, like our go-to bar, and then I'm like, I think those two are on a date, and then we're like observing them, like because they're not making a lot of eye contact and stuff. So I'm like, okay, yeah, I think it is their date.
Progression to naturally occurring. Okay, so that's important. We want to make sure that it progresses to naturally occurring reinforcement because you don't want them to become dependent on every time I clap my hands, she gives me a goldfish, because that's not natural. So it's really important that we change them up to that intermittent schedule to progress them to naturally occurring reinforcement. Defining basic intermittent schedules of reinforcement. Okay, so now it's going to start talking about ratio and interval schedules and fixed and variable. So those are all those FR and VR and FI and VI type of schedules of reinforcement. Those are pretty basic. So as a technician, those are kind of the ones that they learn. So those will be pretty easy for us to explain. Let's see, where are we? Ratio and interval. Behavior analysts directly or indirectly embed ratio and interval intermittent schedules of reinforcement in most treatment programs, especially ratio schedules. Ratio schedules require a number of responses before one response produces reinforcement. So what I always tell my technicians is whenever you think of ratio, the R's match, right? R equals R. So ratio equals response. So for however many R's, so let's say I have him on an FR1, it's for every one correct response, he gets access to reinforcement. If it's an FR2, it's going to be for every 2 correct response, he's going to get access to reinforcement. So those are going to be your ratio schedules. And then you have interval schedules require an elapse of time. So remember, anytime you see interval, that's going to be talking about time. So I tell the technician same thing, I equals time. So anytime you see FI blank, it's going to equal FI or F time. What am I trying to say? Okay, so let's say it's a fixed interval of 1, then that's going to be a fixed interval of 1 minute. If it's a VI 1, then it's going to be a varied interval of approximately 1 minute. So I've heard different things about how people say to do your varied schedule. Some people say go up 2, down 2, or go up 1, down 1. I really think it's just varied, you know, like just keep it as unpredictable as possible so that you don't confuse yourself. So I don't know how you guys have learned it, up 1, down 1, up 2, down 2. But just remembering that if it's varied, it's not going to be the same every time. Has anybody ever heard that before? The up 1, down 1, up 2, down 2? No?
I haven't.
So, so let's say I have my client on a varied interval of 1 minute. And so that I could try to explain to the technician what that means, I tell them just go up 1 or down 1. So you can either reinforce them after every, okay, 1 is not a good example. So let's say an FI of 2 minutes. So a VI of 2 minutes, a varied interval schedule of 2 minutes. So just give him reinforcement on an average of 2. So you can reinforce him after every 1, after every 2, or after every 3, but just change it up every time so that he doesn't know, but it stays on an average of 2. So I'm not going to go up to 10 minutes because he's on a VI of 2, and I know that he doesn't have the capability of going up to the 10. So you can keep him up 1 or down 1. So 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, it will be your safe zone, unless your BCBA says you can go up to down 2. So that's the part where I'm saying that some people are like, it's supposed to be 2. I'm like, I really don't think it matters as long as you're staying on an average of that number that was given, that was defined for you. Does that make sense?
I think so. It was a bit confusing.
Let's see, how could I explain it better? So maybe I can like write it, draw it. Okay, so let's say I have Eileen on a intermittent, which is AKA variable. So I have Eileen on a varied interval of 2. So what that means is she's on a varied interval schedule of 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. And so what that means is that I have to vary it up, the reinforcement. So she's not going to always get reinforcement after every 2 minutes. So you can go, you want to stay on an average of 2. So what I tell my technicians is, in order to remain on an average of 2, then you can do 1, 2, or 3, but you're going to change it up. So you can give Eileen reinforcement after 2 minutes sometimes, after 3 minutes sometimes, or maybe sometimes she's being really good, so I give it to her after 1 minute. So varied schedules of reinforcement are giving you that that clinical judgment part where it's like I'm giving the control a little bit more to the technician, but I'm telling them, please stay on an average of 2 minutes. So that's what I mean by that. But what I was saying is that some people, they'll say to go up 2 or down 2, which I mean, I guess you could do that as well. So let's say I tell you, okay, Peace, you can give Eileen reinforcement after an average, because it's varied, it's intermittent. So it's not going to be 4 every time. It's going to be on an average of 4. So if we're going by the up 2, down 2 people, then we'll say 5, 6, and then 3 and 2. So these people might give her reinforcement after every 2 minutes, after every 4 minutes, or after every 6 minutes. It's just a different way of, I guess, saying on an average of. So it just depends up to you, the BCBA, to determine how you want to train your technicians on a varied schedule. But that might get too technical for them. So just say on an average of 4 minutes, but don't go over 6 or something like that. So it could be easier for them to understand. this was just like an easy visual for people who were not able to understand like what average meant. Does that help?
Yeah, so you can give on 2 or 3, but you can't give on 1, right?
For this one?
Yes.
Yeah, so they say to just go staying on the average of 4. So 1 might be too soon. That might be
Okay.
too easy for him because we know that he could go up to 4. So you don't want to go all the way down to 1 for a guy that might be capable for 4. But a lot of people aren't really that picky about it. The way that I train my staff is I tell them to use their clinical judgment. I tell them, hey, if he's having a really bad day, and you know that he's on a VR2, or I mean a VI of 4 minutes, maybe let's stay on the lower side today because he's having a bad day. So let's get him access to reinforcement quicker because he's not having a good day today. So we'll give it to him after every 2 or 4 or 2, 3, 4 or something like that, keeping him on the low side of his varied schedule, but still keeping it varied.
Okay.
It can get very technical and people train it differently. So I don't know, you guys give me your feedback. How were you trained on varied schedules?
I mean, I don't think that I was really taught exactly how to implement it, but rather to check if you're implementing it by making a note somehow of when you're giving reinforcement and then going back and doing an average and using that to like check yourself and give yourself feedback for the following one. And that if you're having a hard time, you can try to like write out the different numbers that will give you an average of that. So if your VR is 4, you can write out a variety of numbers that will give you 4 when you average them, and then use those numbers for reinforcement.
Yeah, there's like a very there's actually like a math to it.
Yeah.
And I did have a BCBA one time that was actually counting how many I was doing, and that really stressed me out. So I can explain to you guys like the technical like equation, but I don't want to do that to you and mess you up. So I don't think anybody is that picky as long as you're staying on an average of the reinforcement schedule that they have defined for you. I hope that helps. Okay, and then we have fixed and variable schedules. So knowing the difference between fixed and variable. So fixed, we talked about fixed is going to be delivered after after a fixed amount of either time or responses. So if you see an F, we know that that is going to stay that number always. We're not going to go up 1, down 1. We're not going to average it out. If it says F, that means that BCBA wants you to reinforce on an FR1. So if it's a new learner or a new skill, I'll usually put them on an FR1. And I want it to be an FR1. I don't want you to vary it up, be like, oh, well, he's got it now, and then start just doing whatever, because you might lose that skill because you're not reinforcing it frequently enough. So if they said fixed, that means it has to stay that number. And then if they say varied, that means that it can be a variable schedule, kind of like the slot machines where it happens, but we just don't know when it's going to happen. Okay, and then thinning reinforcement. So one thing about ABA that I've noticed is that they say things that don't really mean, like it means the opposite.
I would say like, yeah, the opposite or backwards.
Yeah, so like thinning a schedule. Hold on, I always have to like think about it hard. Let me just read it so I don't say something crazy. Okay.
It's okay. I always sound insane when I try to like explain it to somebody.
Yes.
They're like, what? That makes no sense. I'm like, well, that's what Cooper said.
Yeah, that's what they call it. Okay, so fixed ratio requires the completion of a fixed number of responses for a reinforcer. So we talked about that one. Fixed ratio produces a typical pattern of responding. After the first response of the ratio requirement, the participant completes the required response with little hesitation between and a B post reinforcement pause. Oh, that's something you guys need to know, right? Aren't there questions on the mocks about post reinforcement pause?
Yes.
So that one has to do with FR schedules, right? So fixed ratio schedule, after the first response of the ratio requirement, the participant completes the required response with little hesitation between responses. A post-reinforcement pause follows reinforcement. The participant does not respond for a period following reinforcement. So the size of the ratio and the reinforcement magnitude can influence the duration of the post reinforcement pause. So a large ratio requirement may produce long pauses. Small ratio produces short pauses. Lower reinforcement magnitudes, an inverse relation to large ratio, may produce a long pause, indicating that magnitude and ratio size interact to determine the extent of pausing. Following the pause, the participant again completes the fixed ratio with little hesitation between responses. Analysts often identify this characteristic of FR responding as a break and run pattern. FR schedules often produce high rates of response. So that's something that you need to know, right? Highlight. FR schedules produce high rates of response. Quick responding on an FR schedule maximizes the delivery of reinforcement because the higher rate of response, the greater the rate of reinforcement. So people work rapidly with a fixed ratio because they receive reinforcement upon completion of the ratio requirements. Okay, so people who are on an FR1 or that are on an FR are going to work faster for you because they know when the reinforcement is coming, right? That's what they're saying.
Mhm.
The size of the ratio can influence the rate of response on the FR schedule to a degree. The larger the ratio requirement, the higher the rate of response. A teacher could reinforce every third correct answer to arithmetic facts. With this ratio requirement, the student might complete 12 problems within the specified time, producing reinforcement 4 times. The student might complete more problems in less time if the teacher arranged reinforcement contingent on 12 correct answers rather than 3. The higher ratio is likely to produce a higher rate of response. The rate of response decreases, however, if the ratio requirements are too large. Oh, we know about that, right? What happens if the requirement is too large?
It's not worth it.
Yeah, it might lose its value. So if ratio requirements are raised gradually over an extended period, extremely high ratio requirements can be reached. So just be very careful that you're not causing that ratio strain. So know how far they can go basically with those ratio schedules. Oh, and then you have to know these little graphs, right? Don't they have those all over the place? Reinforcement delivered contingent on emission of a specified number of responses. So schedule effects. After reinforcement, a post-reinforcement pause occurs. After the pause, the ratio requirement is completed with a high rate of response and very little hesitation between responses. The size of the ratio influences both the pause and the rate. So in this graph, they're showing us the post-reinforcement pause is A. So every time it's flat, that's going to be our post-reinforcement pause. B is the up, the run, is going to be the high rate of response. And C is where the reinforcement is delivered. So with the FRs, we see that they're reinforcing, or they're responding quickly. They're running to their reinforcement because they know that it's coming right away. So that's what they're saying, the high rate of response with a small post-reinforcement pause because they know that their reinforcement is coming quickly.
So the pause is a time between the last reinforcer and then the first and then the next reinforcer, right?
Between the first reinforcer
The previous and then the next.
the next SD.
Yeah.
Or yeah, the next reinforcement opportunity.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, then we have varied ratio. So varied ratio schedules of reinforcement require the completion of a varied number of responses to produce the reinforcer. So that's the one that we talked about on an average. Oh, look, they give you the mathematic equation if you guys want to mess with your brain. So for example, with a VR10 schedule, every 10th correct response on the average produces reinforcement. Reinforcement can come after 1 response, 14 response, 5 response, 19 response, or n responses, but the average number of responses required for reinforcement is 10. So that is what Eileen was explaining, where there's actually like a math behind it. So on an average, he has to, so a VR is kind of the same as an FR because we're going to require the same amount of responses, but now we're going to put them on an average. So instead of it being fixed, so an FR10, he's going to be reinforced on an average of 10. So it has to equal up to 10 is what they're saying here.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wait. Okay, they're explaining it.
So basically what you do is you add up how many the rate of reinforcement. So when they were reinforced, you add it all together and then you divide by the number of occurrences. So in this case, there's 5 numbers. So they added the numbers up to 50 and then they divided by 5 and they got 10.
Oh, okay. So that one, that's pretty intense. Well, I hope you guys don't have to do any mathematic equations for VR because that will be really confusing. Do they on the test? I really don't think so. The operation of a slot machine, the one-arm bandit, provides a good example of a VR schedule. These machines are programmed to pay off only a certain proportion of the times they are played. A player cannot predict when the next operation of the machine will pay off. The player might win 2 or 3 times in succession and then not win again for 20 or more plays. And then it's going to talk about examining the effects of a VR schedule. And then it's probably going to tell us how valuable a VR schedule is, right? Do you guys want me to read this example and that can be our last thing?
Okay.
Okay, so let's see. They examined the effects of a VR schedule on 3 obese and 3 non-obese children rate of pedaling an exercise bicycle. The children could use the exercise bicycle Monday to Friday during each week of the analysis, but received no encouragement to do so. The participants received the instruction to exercise as long as you like to initiate the baseline condition. DeLuca and Holborn introduced the VR schedule of reinforcement after establishing a stable baseline rate of pedaling. They calculated the baseline mean number of pedal revolutions per minute and programmed the first VR contingency at approximately 15% faster pedaling than the baseline mean. The children received points on the VR schedule to exchange for backup reinforcers. DeLuca and Holborn increased the VR schedule to 2 additional increments by approximately 15% per increment. All participants had systematic increase in the rate of pedaling with each VR value, meaning that the larger the variable ratio, the higher the rate of response. Okay, so that's important. Should we highlight it? Larger the variable ratio, the higher the rate of response. DeLuca and Holborn reported that the VR schedule produced higher rates of response than the FR schedule in the previous study. So it's telling us that that VR schedule is more valuable than the FR schedule. And then it's giving us the figures of what happened in baseline. And then as they were increasing the varied schedule, the behaviors were also increasing. They went up to VR 125. And then they were pedaling and pedaling and pedaling at higher rates during the higher ratio schedules. Okay. Oh, and then, we could talk about thinning and ratio strain, and then we'll go. Okay, applied behavior analysts often use one of 2 procedures for schedule thinning. First, they thin an existing schedule by gradually increasing. So this is a part that's like confusing. So you thin something out by increasing the response ratio or the duration of the time interval. So if a student has answered addition facts effectively and responded well to a CRF schedule for 2 or 3 sessions, the teacher might thin the reinforcement contingency slowly from 1 correct addition fact. So he's going from a FR, so a continuous schedule of reinforcement, to a VR. So that is us thinning our schedule of reinforcement. Oh, I know. The way you could think about it is that you're thinning the reinforcement schedule so that eventually it's like they no longer are requiring you as a reinforcer, right? So they don't need me anymore. I thinned myself out and now there's 0 me. So maybe that can help your brain to understand it.
Like that example better.
I was just thinking about it in like a really weird way, but if you talk about somebody's hair thinning, there's like more space between each strand of hair. And
that's a good one.
When you're thinning like the reinforcement, there's more space between the reinforcement, just like you get more space between your hair.
I like that. You see, this is why we have to talk so that we could put all of our weird brains together so that we can remember. Yeah, so thinning, her hair is thinning and she's got more space in between each strand, poor girl. Or the way that I was saying it, they're thinning Selena out until there's zero Selena in the picture. So no more Selena. They don't need me to be there. Yay, good job, you did it. I thinned myself out to nothing. And then the opposite goes for thickening a schedule of reinforcement, right? So if they say, oh, we had him on a VR of 15, but now we've noticed that there's a lot of non-compliance. There's a high latency or high latency from SD to response. He's no longer motivated. And so we know that now we caused something that's called ratio strain. It can result from an abrupt increase in ratio requirements when moving from a denser to a thinner reinforcement schedule. Also, ratio strain will occur when the ratio becomes so large that the reinforcement cannot maintain the response level. So this is what we always say about reinforcement not equaling the response. So the amount of effort doesn't equal the reinforcement or how often you're giving me reinforcement. So now you caused the poor little baby to go into ratio strain. Common behaviors or characteristics associated with ratio strain: avoidance, aggression, unpredictable pauses in responding. So that's why they say that continuous schedules of reinforcement are good for new learners, or also for people who just randomly started engaging in high levels of aggression. And it's like, whoa, 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 what happened here? So you might have to go the other way, where you're like, okay, I'm gonna go from the varied schedule back to an FR, so that he is able to gain access to reinforcement more quickly, so that we can figure out what's going on with the behaviors and work our way from there. Analysts can again gradually thin ratio requirements after recovering the behavior. So let's say we got it back under control, client is no longer engaging in aggression. Turns out she was just on her period that day. So then we're like, oh, okay, well, now we can gradually go back to where we were after we recover, or go back down to what we call HRE. Have you guys heard that word or that term? It's a new modern thing that Handley uses in his assessment, his functional assessment. HRE is it means happy, relaxed, and engaged. So sometimes you'll have to wait until you get your client back to HRE before you can go back to that old schedule of reinforcement. So that's something, HRE, you guys won't need to know it for the exam, but that is a term that Handley uses for his functional analysis assessments. And you'll see people in the field now, like on Instagram or whatever, they talk about HRE a lot. And that's what it means: happy, relaxed, and engaged. So once client is back to his HRE place, then we can go back to his regular scheduled programming. Okay, I think we can pause there. So we'll remember that we ended on 310. I really love this, you guys. I don't have to look down in my book anymore. My book is gonna miss me. Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording.